Some marriages don't end with shouting or slammed doors. They unravel quietly, through small changes that are easy to explain away until they are no longer small at all. This story begins in that quiet space where trust starts to thin, where routine becomes fragile, and where one ordinary message exposes how far two people have drifted apart. What follows is not a confession nor a warning shouted too late. It is a careful look at how subtle choices accumulate, how denial can feel safer than truth, and how one person's calm observation can become the most unsettling response of all. If you find stories like this meaningful, consider subscribing, liking the video, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. On a Wednesday afternoon in early spring, Mark Reynolds was finishing the last report of the day in his home office. At 49, he had reached the stage of life where routines mattered. Wednesdays meant takeout from the Chinese restaurant down the street and an unspoken agreement that he and his wife, Linda, would sit together on the couch and talk about their week. It wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs. At 4:47 p.m., his phone vibrated. "Don't wait up tonight. Working late at a conference." Mark read the message twice. Linda rarely worked late without advance warning. In their 8 years of marriage, she had always shared her complaints early and often. Mandatory meetings, office politics, dull presentations. She had never spared him the details. This message was different. Short, flat, almost formal. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. They had plans, nothing fancy, but plans all the same. He felt the first ripple of unease, the kind people often dismiss as overthinking. Still, something about the timing bothered him. Over the past few weeks, Linda had been coming home later than usual. She took calls in other rooms, kept her phone face down on the table, and spoke in vague summaries about her day. When Mark asked questions, she answered politely, but without the warmth he remembered. And there was Ryan. Ryan from accounting came up in conversation more often than Mark was comfortable with. Ryan had opinions. Ryan had stories. Ryan apparently had a sharp sense of humor and a knack for understanding office frustrations. Mark noticed how Linda smiled when she mentioned him, how quickly she defended his ideas. Mark wasn't prone to jealousy. He had built his career on logic and patience, but patterns were patterns, and he had learned long ago not to ignore them. After several minutes of staring at the message, Mark typed a response. "Hope you and Ryan enjoy the presentation." He sent it and set the phone down. The reply didn't come as a text. It came as a call. Linda never called during work hours unless something was wrong. "Hey," she said quickly, her voice brighter than usual. "I just saw your message." Mark stayed calm. "I figured Ryan would be there. You mentioned him a lot." There was a pause, followed by a small laugh that sounded rehearsed. "Well, yeah, maybe. It's a big conference, lots of people." "What's it about again?" Mark asked. Another pause. "Compliance updates. You know how those things are." Mark did know. He worked in the same industry, at a competing firm. He also knew that her company rarely scheduled conferences mid-quarter and never ones that stretched late into the evening. "What time does it end?" he asked. "Late, 10 or 11. Then networking." "On a Wednesday," Mark said evenly. "Well, that's corporate life." They ended the call politely, but the conversation left Mark with more questions than answers. He checked the time. 5:03 p.m. If Linda was at a time-sensitive conference, she wouldn't have stepped away to explain herself so thoroughly. After a few minutes, Mark logged into their shared mobile account. He hadn't planned to. He didn't enjoy the feeling of suspicion. But curiosity, once awakened, is difficult to quiet. Linda's location services were active. Her phone wasn't near her office building. It was across town, at a restaurant called Bella Roma, an Italian place known for dim lighting and quiet booths. Mark had driven past it many times. It wasn't the kind of place people chose for work dinners unless the work was personal. Mark closed his laptop and sat still. He didn't feel anger yet. What he felt was clarity. For weeks he had noticed small changes and chosen generosity over suspicion. Now the pieces fit together with uncomfortable precision. Instead of confronting Linda immediately, Mark sent another message. "Hope you and Ryan enjoy the presentation." He watched the location update in real time. Within seconds, the dot representing her phone began moving quickly, not walking, running. 18 minutes later, Mark heard keys fumbling at the front door. Linda entered the house breathless, her smile strained. "The conference got canceled," she said. "Technical issues." Mark nodded calmly. "Good thing you hadn't ordered dinner yet." She blinked. "Dinner?" "At the conference," he replied mildly. "Would have been a shame to waste money." Linda laughed too quickly. Mark noticed the faint scent of garlic and a small stain on her blouse she hadn't worn earlier that day. "How was Ryan?" Mark asked casually. Her face lost color. "Why do you keep asking about him?" "You talk about him so much," Mark said. "I feel like I know the guy." That night, Linda kept her phone close and flinched whenever it buzzed. When an unfamiliar number called twice, she declined both times. She went to bed early, claiming exhaustion, but Mark heard whispers behind the bedroom door. Later, alone in his office, Mark searched for Ryan online. It didn't take long. Social media is generous with other people's truths. Ryan's most recent post showed a candlelit table at a Bella Roma. The caption read, "Great dinner with someone special." Mark saved the image and shut down his computer. Analysis and commentary. What stands out in this moment is not confrontation, but restraint. Mark does not raise his voice or accuse. Instead, he observes. That choice matters. When trust erodes, people often rush toward emotional certainty, hoping anger will clarify confusion. But clarity rarely comes from reaction. Linda's behavior reflects a common pattern, partial truths wrapped in believable language. None of her statements were dramatic lies on their own. Each explanation borrowed credibility from routine. Conferences happen, networking happens, long days happen. The issue is not a single excuse, but how many excuses are needed to maintain a version of reality. Mark's calm unsettles because it removes the opportunity for deflection. There is nothing to argue against when someone simply notices. In long-term relationships, that quiet noticing can be more revealing than any accusation. This moment is not yet about infidelity. It is about distance, about how easily emotional space opens when communication shifts from shared experience to managed information. Linda is no longer inviting Mark into her world. She is managing his access to it. That night, the house felt different. The familiar rhythms were still there, the hum of appliances, the glow of the television, but something essential had shifted. Mark did not yet know what he would do with what he had learned. He only knew that pretending nothing was wrong was no longer an option. And so, in the quiet hours after midnight, he chose not confrontation, but attention, allowing the truth to surface at its own pace. Once doubt enters a marriage, it rarely announces itself loudly. It lingers instead, settling into ordinary moments and changing how they feel. What once passed unnoticed becomes loaded with meaning. A glance, a pause, a routine excuse, each one carries weight it never had before. In this part of the story, the focus shifts from suspicion to observation, from instinct to evidence. Not because proof is satisfying, but because uncertainty is exhausting, especially for someone who values clarity over confrontation. If you find stories like this meaningful, consider subscribing, liking the video, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. The next morning, Mark woke to an empty side of the bed. The sheets were cool, undisturbed for hours. That detail mattered more than it should have. Linda usually lingered in the mornings, even when she left early. This time, she was gone before sunrise. On the kitchen counter, a neatly folded note waited. "Emergency meeting. Back tonight. Love you." Mark stared at the handwriting. It was familiar, careful, almost overly neat. He folded the note and slipped it into his pocket, not because he needed to keep it, but because something about throwing it away felt dishonest. He poured himself coffee and sat at the table longer than usual, letting the quiet settle. Emergency meeting on a Thursday didn't align with anything he knew about Linda's company. Still, he said nothing. Instead, he called in sick to work for the first time in years. Whatever was happening deserved his full attention. By mid-morning, Mark parked across the street from Linda's office building. He told himself he wasn't hoping to catch her in a lie. He was hoping to be wrong. Cars moved in and out of the lot. Employees walked through the front doors in familiar clusters. Linda's car never appeared. After an hour, Mark drove across town to Bella Roma. The restaurant was quiet at that time of day, tables still set from the night before. He approached the hostess with a calm smile. "Excuse me," he said. "I think my wife left an earring here last night. She was dining around 7. The hostess brightened. "Oh yes, I remember them. Lovely couple." The word couple landed heavily. "They seemed very close," the hostess continued, unaware. "Celebrating something, I think. They ordered the anniversary special." Mark thanked her and left without another word. Back in his car, he sat still for several minutes. Anniversaries had meaning to him. 8 years of shared life reduced to a quiet dinner meant for someone else. At home, Mark moved through the house with measured steps. He didn't search frantically. He didn't rush. He thought carefully about where someone would hide something they didn't want to lose but couldn't risk displaying. Linda's workout bag sat by the door. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a silver bracelet. The engraving was simple. "Always yours." Mark photographed it and placed it back exactly where he found it. Later, when Linda's laptop chimed with an incoming email notification, Mark noticed the screen was still unlocked. He hadn't planned to look, but the message preview caught his eye. "Miss you already," he scrolled, carefully, reading weeks of correspondence. What began as work-related exchanges gradually shifted in tone. Compliments replaced logistics. Confessions replaced updates. The messages grew more personal, more intimate, until they crossed a line that couldn't be misunderstood. Mark saved copies and closed the laptop. When Linda came home that evening, she looked tired but oddly relieved. She spoke quickly, filling the silence with small talk. Mark listened, nodding, offering nothing that could be challenged. Later, as they sat on the couch, Linda checked her phone repeatedly. When it buzzed, she jumped. "Popular night," Mark observed. "Spam," she said too quickly. Before bed, she changed perfume. Mark noticed, though he said nothing. The following day, Mark called Linda's office under a different pretense. The receptionist confirmed casually that Linda was no longer scheduled to work Fridays. She had switched to a 4-day week months ago. Mark ended the call with a polite thank you. That Friday morning, Linda dressed for work as usual. She kissed Mark on the cheek and left with her bag over her shoulder. Mark waited 5 minutes, then followed. She didn't drive toward her office. Instead, she turned into a residential complex 15 minutes away. Mark parked discreetly and waited. 40 minutes later, a man appeared at an upstairs window. He waved down toward the parking lot. Linda emerged soon after, adjusting her jacket as she walked to her car. Mark stayed where he was until she drove away. That evening, Linda returned home cheerful, energetic, humming as she cooked dinner. She spoke about a productive day, a completed project, a sense of relief. Mark listened. Analysis and commentary. This stage of discovery is often the most difficult, not because the truth is unclear, but because it becomes undeniable. Mark no longer wonders if something is happening. He understands what is happening, and that knowledge changes the emotional landscape entirely. Notice how Linda's behavior doesn't collapse under scrutiny. It adapts. New explanations replace old ones. Details are added not to clarify, but to distract. This is not malicious in the cinematic sense. It is defensive. People often lie not to deceive others, but to preserve an image of themselves they are not ready to abandon. Mark's response is significant. He does not weaponize what he learns. He gathers information with care, almost respectfully. This is not passivity. It is self-control. He is choosing to act from understanding rather than impulse. The shift from emotional suspicion to factual awareness is subtle but profound. Once evidence exists, the question is no longer about trust alone. It becomes about boundaries and dignity. What someone does with that knowledge defines who they are moving forward. By the end of the week, Mark understood the shape of the truth. He didn't feel dramatic or righteous. He felt steady. The guessing was over, replaced by something quieter and heavier. For the first time in days, he slept without replaying conversations in his mind, knowing that the next step would require not emotion, but resolve. There is a moment, often overlooked, when certainty replaces hope. It is not loud or theatrical. It arrives quietly, when a person realizes they are no longer searching for answers, but deciding what kind of life they are willing to live with the answers they already have. This part of the story is about that moment. Not confrontation yet, but preparation. Not anger, but alignment between knowledge and self-respect. If you find stories like this meaningful, consider subscribing, liking the video, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Mark didn't confront Linda after following her that Friday. He didn't raise his voice or demand explanations. Instead, he watched her carefully over the weekend, noticing how easily she slipped back into routine. Grocery shopping, laundry, casual. Conversation about neighbors and television shows. She played her role well, which only made the distance between them feel wider. On Sunday morning, Linda slept in. Mark sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, sunlight stretching across the floor. He created a new email address, one Linda wouldn't recognize, and forwarded every screenshot he had taken, messages, timestamps, photographs, confirmations. He labeled the folder simply, Records. This wasn't revenge. It was organization. That afternoon, he made a call to a local attorney. The conversation was brief and professional. When asked about the nature of the issue, Mark used one word: adultery. The lawyer didn't react emotionally. He asked practical questions instead. Evidence, timeline, assets, Mark answered calmly. By the end of the call, an appointment was scheduled for the following week. When Linda came downstairs later, she noticed Mark reading an article on his tablet. "What's that?" she asked, casually. "Workplace relationships," Mark replied. "HR research." Linda's expression flickered for just a moment before settling into neutrality. "Interesting," Mark nodded. "According to this, most affairs don't start physically. They start with conversations, complaining, feeling understood." Linda sat down slowly, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug. "It also says," Mark continued, turning the page, "that secrecy changes people. They become defensive, distracted. They start justifying small lies because they feel cornered." Linda laughed lightly. "Sounds dramatic." "It says the person involved often doesn't realize how obvious the change is," Mark said evenly. She didn't respond. That night, Linda took another call in the bedroom with the door closed. Mark didn't follow. He didn't need to. He had moved beyond needing confirmation. Monday morning, Linda left early again. Mark waited an hour before making a call to her office. This time, he didn't disguise his voice. The receptionist was polite, efficient. "No, sir," she said. "Linda isn't scheduled today. She called in sick." Mark thanked her and hung up. He spent the day reviewing finances, joint accounts, credit cards, mortgage paperwork. Nothing dramatic, just an inventory. He was surprised by how calm he felt. Once the emotional fog lifted, practical thinking came easily. That evening, Linda returned home looking tired. She smiled when she saw him. "How was your day?" she asked. "Productive," Mark replied. She hesitated. "Mine too." He watched her closely. There was tension now, an awareness that hadn't been there before. She sensed something had changed, even if she didn't know exactly what. Later, as Linda showered, Mark noticed her phone on the dresser. The case was new. Blue. He remembered seeing that same color on Ryan's social media more than once. He didn't touch the phone. The detail was enough. Over dinner, Mark spoke gently. "You've been working a lot," he said. "I know," Linda replied quickly. "It's temporary." "Is it?" She paused. "What do you mean?" "Nothing," Mark said. "Just noticing." The next morning, Mark made another call, this time to Linda's company again, under the pretense of sending a delivery. The receptionist chatted easily. "Linda doesn't work Fridays anymore," she said. "Switched schedules months ago." Mark ended the call and sat quietly. When Linda came downstairs, dressed for work that Friday, Mark smiled at her. "Busy day?" he asked. "Yes," she said without hesitation. He watched her leave, then followed. The routine repeated exactly. Same apartment complex, same entrance, same waiting. This time, Mark stayed longer, watching the rhythm of the place, noting how practiced everything looked. When Linda emerged, Mark didn't feel shock. He felt confirmation. That evening, Linda returned. Home unusually cheerful. She hummed while cooking, touched Mark's arm as she passed, spoke about plans for the weekend. "You seem lighter," Mark said. She smiled. "Just relieved. Work stress finally easing." Mark nodded. That night he slept deeply for the first time in weeks. Analysis and commentary. This is the phase many people misunderstand. Outsiders often ask, why not just confront her? But confrontation without clarity often leads to denial, deflection, and emotional chaos. Mark's restraint is not weakness, it is discernment. Linda's behavior illustrates how compartmentalization works. She doesn't see herself as dishonest. She sees herself as managing different parts of her life separately. That mental separation allows her to act sincerely in the moment while still betraying trust overall. Mark's shift is internal. He is no longer trying to preserve the relationship at all costs. He is evaluating whether the relationship still aligns with his values. That is a critical distinction. Love can motivate patience, but self-respect determines limits. By focusing on facts rather than feelings, Mark protects himself from being pulled into arguments about perception and intent. He is preparing not to punish, but to exit with dignity. By the end of that week, Mark no longer wondered whether the marriage could return to what it had been. He understood that the real question was whether he wanted to remain in something that required this much denial to sustain. And with that understanding, he began to accept that clarity, once reached, cannot be undone. Confrontation is often imagined as explosive, a collision of truth and denial. In reality, it can be quiet, even restrained. By the time it arrives, the emotional outcome has already been decided. What remains is not discovery, but acknowledgement. This part centers on that reckoning, not as punishment, but as a line drawn with clarity and resolve. If you find stories like this meaningful, consider subscribing, liking the video, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and a deceptive calm. Mark moved through the kitchen with deliberate ease, making coffee and toast as if it were any other weekend. Linda came downstairs moments later, her hair still damp, wearing a soft sweater she often reserved for days she wanted to appear relaxed. "You're up early," she said. "I couldn't sleep," Mark replied evenly. Linda smiled and reached for her mug. "I was thinking we could do something spontaneous today. Maybe drive out of town." Mark looked up. "Actually, I had the same thought." Her expression brightened. "Really?" "Yes," he said. "But first, I need to stop by your office." The smile faded almost instantly. "My office?" "I left some paperwork in the car earlier this week," Mark continued calmly. "It's parked nearby. Shouldn't take long." Linda set the mug down, carefully. "It's the weekend. Security's strict." "I'll stay with you," Mark said. "It's fine." She hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." The drive was quiet. Linda stared out the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap. When they pulled into the nearly empty parking lot, Mark noticed how slowly she moved getting out of the car. "Looks quiet," he said. "Most people don't work weekends," she replied. They approached the entrance together. The security guard recognized Linda immediately. "Morning," he said. "Don't usually see you on weekends." "Just stopping by," Linda answered quickly. The guard smiled at Mark. "And this must be your husband." Mark shook his hand. "Nice to meet you." As they stood there, Mark spoke casually. "Linda's been swamped with Friday projects lately. I wanted to see where all the work happens." The guard frowned slightly. "Friday projects?" "Yes," Mark said. "She's here every Friday." The guard hesitated. "Sir, Linda doesn't work Fridays anymore. She switched to a 4-day schedule months ago." The silence that followed felt heavy. Mark turned to Linda. Her face had lost all color. "What do you mean?" Mark asked softly. The guard glanced between them. "She hasn't been scheduled Fridays since March." Mark nodded. "Thank you." They walked back to the car without speaking. At home, Mark sat down at the dining table. Linda stood across from him, hands clasped tightly. "You want to explain where you've been going every Friday?" Mark asked. Linda's voice trembled. "I can explain." "I'm listening." She took a breath. "I've been seeing someone." Mark nodded once. "I know." Her eyes widened. "You do?" "I followed you," he said simply. "I saw everything." Tears spilled over immediately. I never meant to hurt you. Mark's tone remained calm. Yet you did. Repeatedly. It started as talking, she said quickly. I felt lonely. We were distant. You chose to talk to someone else instead of me, Mark replied. I didn't plan for it to happen, she said. It just evolved. Every Friday for 2 months, Mark said. That's not evolution. That's routine. She sank into a chair, crying openly now. I'm sorry. I made a mistake. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary, Mark said. This was a series of choices. Linda looked up at him, desperation in her eyes. What are you going to do? I've already met with a lawyer, Mark replied. I'm filing for divorce. Her breath caught. Please don't do this. I'll end it. I'll quit my job. We can go to counseling. Mark stood. You don't end an 8-year marriage by accident. You end it by prioritizing yourself over the person you promised to protect. She reached for his arm, but he stepped back. You need to move out, he said. By tomorrow, Linda shook her head. I have nowhere to go. That's not my responsibility anymore. That night, Linda packed quietly in the guest room. Mark slept alone, not with anger, but with certainty. The next morning he made several calls, the bank, his attorney, Linda's parents. Each conversation was brief, factual, respectful. When Linda came downstairs with her suitcases, Mark handed her a folder. What's this? She asked. Account information, he said. You're off the joint accounts. You'll need to arrange your own finances. Her hands shook as she took it. This isn't fair. Fair ended when honesty did, Mark replied. At the door, Linda paused. I loved you. Mark met her eyes. Then you should have acted like it. She left without another word. Analysis and commentary. This confrontation is notable not for its intensity, but for its restraint. Mark doesn't demand explanations to soothe his ego. He doesn't argue about intentions or feelings. He focuses on actions and consequences. Linda's response reflects a common pattern, regret framed as surprise. She is shocked not by what she did, but by the fact that it has consequences she cannot negotiate away. Her offers to quit to attend counseling come after the betrayal is complete, not before. Mark's strength lies in timing. He confronts only when he no longer needs validation. By then, the outcome is not something to be debated, only acknowledged. This is what emotional closure looks like when guided by self-respect rather than revenge. Boundaries, once crossed repeatedly, cannot always be redrawn. Sometimes the most compassionate response, for both parties, is to end what no longer reflects mutual respect. After the door closed behind Linda, the house felt quiet in a different way. Not empty, but settled. Mark stood for a long moment in the hallway, listening to nothing at all. For the first time in months, there was no confusion left to manage, only a future to rebuild, one deliberate choice at a time. The end of a marriage is rarely the end of a story. More often, it is the beginning of a reckoning, quiet, practical, and deeply personal. After the dust settles and the doors close, what remains is not drama, but consequence, not revenge, but reality. This final part is about what happens after certainty has been claimed and boundaries enforced. It is about living with those choices and discovering that peace is not found by winning, but by refusing to return to what once caused harm. 6 months passed with little fanfare. Mark did not mark the days on a calendar or count milestones the way some people do after a major loss. Life simply reorganized itself around new truths. The divorce moved quickly. Linda did not contest it. The evidence was clear, and her own admission left little room for negotiation. The house, once shared, became unmistakably Mark's. He repainted the bedroom in neutral tones, replaced the furniture that carried too many memories, and turned the spare room into a small gym. The physical changes mirrored an internal shift. He no longer felt like a guest in his own life. Work improved in ways he hadn't anticipated. Without the constant mental noise of uncertainty, Mark's focus sharpened. He landed new clients, earned a promotion, and found satisfaction in competence rather than distraction. Evenings were no longer spent wondering where someone else was or what version of the truth he was being told. He joined a local hiking group that met on Sundays. The conversations were easy, grounded in shared effort rather than performance. There were no secrets there, no double lives, just People showing up as they were. Linda tried to reach him more than once. The messages came from unfamiliar numbers at first, then through emails he didn't recognize. Each one carried urgency, apologies, requests to talk, explanations that arrived, months too late. Mark read none of them beyond the first line. He blocked each contact without ceremony. One evening, as Mark prepared dinner, the doorbell rang. Through the window, he saw Linda's car in the driveway. She sat on the front steps, shoulders slumped, looking smaller than he remembered. He did not open the door. She stayed for nearly an hour, speaking through the wood, her voice unsteady. She spoke about regret, about losing her job, about how the relationship she had sacrificed everything for ended almost immediately. She said she finally understood what she had done. Mark turned up the television and continued cooking. The next morning, Linda's mother called. Her voice was tired, careful. "She's in the hospital," she said. "Exhaustion, emotional collapse." Mark listened quietly. "I'm sorry to hear that. She keeps asking for you." "I can't help her," Mark replied. "She needs support, but not from me." There was a pause on the line. "You loved her once." "Yes," Mark said. "Once." He ended the call and went for a walk. Later that week, Mark met someone for coffee. Laura, a woman from the hiking group. The conversation was unforced. No explanations required, no vigilance, just curiosity and mutual respect. It felt unfamiliar in the best possible way. As Mark drove home afterward, he realized something quietly profound. He hadn't thought about Linda during the entire afternoon, not once. That absence felt like freedom. Analysis and commentary. What stands out in the aftermath is not triumph, but restraint. Mark does not gloat. He does not seek validation from Linda's collapse or misfortune. He understands something many people struggle to accept. Accountability does not require continued access. Linda's attempt to return is driven not by restored integrity, but by loss. Loss of stability. Loss of comfort. Loss of the version of life that existed before consequences arrived. Regret born of discomfort is not the same as remorse born of understanding. Mark's refusal to re-engage is not cruelty. It is consistency. He does not confuse empathy with obligation. Caring about someone's well-being does not mean reopening doors that were closed for good reason. This is what boundaries look like when they are fully internalized. They are not argued. They are not defended. They simply exist. The most important shift here is identity. Mark no longer defines himself in reaction to betrayal. He defines himself by standards, honesty, respect, stability, and chooses relationships that align with those values. That choice is quiet. It doesn't announce itself, but it changes everything. Months later, as Mark stood in his kitchen on a calm evening, he reflected briefly on how much his life had changed, not through dramatic acts, but through deliberate ones. He had not chased closure. He had created it. He understood now that the best response to betrayal is not anger or forgiveness on demand, but clarity. And clarity, once claimed, does not ask permission to stay. If you found this story thoughtful or meaningful, consider subscribing, liking the video, and sharing your perspective in the comments. Stories like this exist not to inflame, but to remind us that self-respect is not loud. It is steady and it lasts.